invitation to be here. Are we okay with the buttons? Okay. All right, thanks so much for the invitation to be here and for the opportunity to present this work. Of course, I won't be able to explain everything that's in here, but I will give you a sense of the overall argument and the key empirical findings. Let's see if this is. So building on a conversation with Dennis from this morning, I thought it might be useful to say a few things about why I wrote this book in the first place. I think as demographers, most of our intellectual communication and the accomplishments that we need to do in order to get jobs, get promoted, include articles or involve articles. But I really ended up doing this contribution in a book format for a couple of reasons. The first was that there was a key empirical finding from about 15 years of research in Balaka, Malawi that I really wanted to communicate. And that was that at epidemic levels at around 14% HIV prevalence, somewhere around between 40 and 50% of the young adult population is experiencing uncertainty about HIV. And even though I had written a few articles that showed this in the sort of table 1 and elaborated the argument, I never saw it circulated widely. And so I wanted the opportunity to say it again, to say it more decisively, and to take up a little bit more space. The second was from that came a theoretical ambition, a little bit more broadly, or a little bit broader, which is the question of how we might center uncertainty, specifically the things that people know that they don't know in our models of human behavior, and why we should take that more seriously. Now, the third, I might not need to make a big pitch for in this room, but I am in a department that doesn't have the same number of demographers that you have here. And so I wanted to make a contribution that demonstrated the value of demographic research for thinking about questions of meaning, for thinking about questions that other people outside of PAA and outside of our community should be grappling with. And then finally, I wanted to advance this idea of population chatter as a demographic method. The idea here is methodological, combining our staple demographic methods with an ethnographic ear in order to understand how people perceive changes to the fertility, mortality, and migration rates they contribute to and are affected by. So what I'm going to present today draws from 3 different parts of the book. The first, the chapter that really describes the data and the overall survey project that this builds from, and then parts of the introductory vignette and what I think of as the main empirical argument, which is presented in chapter 4 of the book, the scope of HIV uncertainty. So I'll introduce the TLT study and situate the cohort, share the introductory vignette that I used to open the book to illustrate these layers of uncertainty experienced in one woman's life. I'll show the primary finding about HIV prevalence and HIV uncertainty for this cohort over time, and then show how HIV uncertainty is linked to outcomes, things that we care about. Specifically, I'm going to look at health and well-being. So where in the world are we here? Okay, so I'm going to bring you to Malawi, nestled in Southeast Africa, and specifically to the trading town of Balaka, which is in the southern district. Balaka is the southern region in Malawi has higher HIV prevalence than the rest of the country, also earlier ages at first marriage and first birth, and tends to have lower levels of education, specifically for women, than the central and the northern regions, but it gives you a sense of where we are. Now, TLT, the Segola Tanzi project, took a really highly contextualized approach to studying young adulthood. We moved away from the nationally representative work that used the entire reproductive age range and decided just to look at HIV and fertility among young adults between the ages of 15 and 25 in this single community, Balaka, very, very closely. Our point was not to be a mini DHS, but to do something completely different. So when I first designed this study with Sarah Yateman, Abdul Chilungo, and others, we set this up to be an intensive longitudinal study that would collect 9 waves of data at about 4-month intervals over a 3-year period. So we were designed to go from 2009 to 2012. And we knew that we had to study fertility and specifically HIV risk by enrolling a sample of women. And I don't call it this in the book, but this is kind of like the harassment approach to survey research, trying to figure out like what is the shortest possible interval that our respondents will tolerate for participating in this research. Because given high quality studies from the region, DHSs are spaced about 5 years apart. Other high quality studies in the area that were spaced about 2 years apart, using these data for secondary data analysis, we were finding that young women who were in school, never had a boyfriend, were not concerned about HIV, were followed up 2 years later, at which time they had a child, were divorced from the child's father, were infected with HIV or very concerned about their HIV status. Everything we were interested in happened in the inter-survey period, specifically for adolescents and for young adults. We knew that this wouldn't be sustainable over the entire reproductive life course, but we wanted to study them at very, very close intervals for 3 years to see what we could learn about the timing of these events, specifically as relationships were concerned. So because of confidentiality concerns, we thought that this work couldn't reasonably be done with home-based interviews. I had enough experience with this to see very curious sisters-in-law and neighbors hanging out and frank conversations about sex and relationships, HIV risk, contraception aren't necessarily conducive, to those curious mothers and sisters and husbands for that matter in the interview format. So we had to assemble a space which ended up becoming a very important building in the community, in which we turned over in 2012 to become the town assembly office. So this became a pretty large study. We began by enrolling 1,500 women. It was about a 1 in 4 sampling fraction for this age group in the community. Once in the study, women reported on their sexual partnerships, and then they received tokens to give to their partners their male partners who could enroll into the study over time. We enrolled almost 1,000 men in the study over the 3 years in this way, and this facilitates dyadic analysis between women and the men they're making decisions with. As a last-minute decision, we also enrolled a random sample of 600 men between the ages of 15 and 25 at the start of the survey. And this allowed us to find out 2 things. The first was how non-representative our sample of male partners would be. This was something that we could find out from that. And this wasn't as a part of the original study design. None of the reviewers at NIH pointed this out, but right before we started data collection, I realized we really needed to do this to have some cover in the community. So it wasn't totally obvious to everyone that all the men in our study were sleeping with the women at the research center. So it was important to have the representative sample of men in our study for that reason. We assembled a
sense of the density of the community and the sample. Is this like 90% of the people in this age group that are in this town, or is it 5%?
Yeah, so Balaka is it's a 7-kilometer radius around the town's main market. The area was about 57,000 people when we started collecting the data, and it grew to closer to 80,000 10 years later when we got to them in 2019. For the young women, it's a 1 in 4 sampling fraction for their age group. Does that help?
Yeah, so they know each other, they're talking about this, and this is part of.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and women in our study with age-eligible sisters who are not in the study are aware, for example, that one is in the study and the other is not.
Did you sample a broader age range for the 600 men? Because women's partners tend to often be much older than them. So if you wanted to get at selectivity, you'd probably need a much larger age range.
Yeah. No, we sampled men of the exact same age.
So their
age mates, but not the partners.
But then you couldn't necessarily characterize the selectivity of the partners because you're not getting a representative sample of the men 5 or 10 years older. If very often young women have older partners.
Yes. Yes. So we have a sense of how much older the men are vis-a-vis their peers. All right, so we had a large research team, a staff of about 60 people, including supervisors, enumerators, data entry clerks, a gardener, a watchman who was part of our data security protocol, cleaners, and of course, a granny to help wrangle all the babies and toddlers who would be coming out of the research, in and out of the research center on a daily basis. So I describe the research as being situated at three intersections. First is the literal intersection. Balaka is both a growing district capital and what I would describe as a quintessential hinterland, right? It is not a political capital. It's not a commercial capital. This is a trading town that exists at the intersection of the M1, which bisects the country. If you remember how Malawi was shaped like a flame, the main road goes up and down the country. And there's a railway that goes across the country from Mozambique to Mozambique in the south, and then from Mozambique through to Zambia if you follow it further. So there's a lot of movement in Balaka. People tell us that Nchewu, the neighboring district to the north, and Nchewu has market day on Mondays, and Ulongwe has market day on Thursday, but in Balaka, every day is market day. There's just a lot of people coming to this place, moving goods around, selling goods around, and it's a bustling place that's densely populated, home to a district hospital, a government clinic, two private hospitals, about a dozen secondary schools, a 5,000-acre commercial farm, a Chinese-owned cotton ginnery, a limestone factory, a large Italian-run Catholic mission. So there are a lot of different kinds of influences in this religiously and ethnically diverse place. The diversity here is also cultivated through labor migration and through marriage. Southern Malawi is primarily matrilocal, and if you're doing a longitudinal study of women and fertility, you really want to be able to follow the women. So working in a matrilocal setting was very important to us. Upon marriage, a husband typically moves into his new wife's community, and also upon divorce, men lead the wives home, but the women tend to be there in Balaka. Now, the substantive intersection here concerns this relationship between HIV and fertility. I had been studying HIV and religion as part of my dissertation. My collaborator, Sarah Yateman, had been studying HIV and fertility, specifically among older women. And we brought these ideas together, noticing that both HIV and fertility were higher in Malawi's southern region than in the rest of the country, but also thinking about how these two things are related to each other. You'll see that age-specific HIV prevalence rises very precipitously during the exact same years that the age-specific fertility rate is highest, right? And this is no accident. The activities of conception for the families that people want to have are antithetical, right, to the HIV prevention strategies that are promoted by the international community, right? Abstain, be faithful, use condoms. This is how you protect yourself from HIV. The message just saturates all of Anglophone sub-Saharan Africa, not just Malawi, but there is a labyrinth of trade-offs to navigate when you are forming relationships and you want to have children, right? Abstinence and condoms are off the table, and faithfulness to one's partner one can control, but we can't completely control other people, right? So the question was, how do young adults negotiate sex and relationships and childbearing in the context of this very severe epidemic going on around them? And the third intersection I think of as two intellectual traditions in the social sciences, one quantitative and demographic, and the other ethnographic and perhaps more theoretical. Now, writing about the relationship between demography and social history, Daniel Scott Smith once characterized demography as relentlessly and routinely analytical. And he dryly praised the important work of enumerating the size and structure of human populations, writing, and while getting the numbers right may not seem to be much, it is better than getting them wrong. So our study was designed to kind of sit at this intersection of interpretive approaches that privilege the experiential realm and also this empirical relentlessness that demographers are well known for. I see this approach as fitting with Veronique Petit's agenda for what she calls a comprehensive demography. an intellectual pursuit that emphasizes the absolute necessity of anchoring demographic analyses in their specific context. She maintains that data are only meaningful if demographers use the appropriate theoretical resources to provide an interpretive model, and insists on the inseparability of counting and understanding, putting measurement and interpretation on the same plane. And so when I suggest this idea of population chatter, what I'm asking about is I'm asking us to focus on how ordinary people, not demographers, right, not us, perceive changes to the fertility, mortality, and migration rates they contribute to, paying attention to how they narrate and debate these processes and draw or do not causal connections to their own explanations. I think that this helps us produce accounts of how population processes work and what they mean to the people who constitute the rates. The goal here is to make popular perceptions of demographic processes central rather than peripheral to demographic research. And what it does is link this task of counting well with the tasks of understandings. There are lots of examples of people in our field who have done this before. I'm thinking of Jane and Peter Schneider, Jenna Johnson-Hanks, Sarah Randall, and others. What I think that this also requires us to do is constrain a little bit the substantive focus on our core concerns of demography, which I think should remain on fertility, mortality, migration, nuptiality, aging, and health, inequality. But I do have concerns. I've spoken to Jenna about this and others about demography becoming like too similar to just a general quantitative social science. So what I'm positing here is that we sort of constrain our topics and have a little more focus, but be a little more expansive methodologically to put the population chatter and our high quality population estimates, bridging those together to understand demographic phenomena. I think population chatter can be captured in a variety of ways. And among those that I use in the book are traditional ethnography, excerpts of researchers' field notes, including my own, marginalia from surveys, personal correspondence, content analysis of newspapers, and what I do not use, but others may be well suited to, social media content as those data become more available and suitable to some of our questions. So I want to give an example of population chatter by reading an excerpt that I used to introduce the book. And I know it's a little unusual to actually read an ethnographic field note in a demography seminar, but I'm going to ask you to bear with me because I think that the details of the way that Patuma told me this story are very important to understanding her life and the role of uncertainty in it. The context here was a survey was a survey conducted at the Research Center in 2019, at which time one of the interviewers who has been working with us since the very beginning of the study waves me into the room from the data center and says, "Jenny, this respondent is really clever, open about her life, and good at telling stories." And it's important to understand that both Caroline, the interviewer, and the respondents are doubled over in laughter as I get brought into the room to listen to her story. She said, "We are enjoying talking with one another, but I need some paper because my notes will not fit well on this small line for other reason, and we need your help deciding what to put down for her marital status." Marital status is not among the items survey researchers typically consider a complex construct. The choices are straightforward: never married, currently married, cohabiting, divorced, separated, or widowed. However, Patuma's marriage wasn't its complicated situation, and her vivid narration took me on a journey from uncertainty to certainty and back again. My husband and I have 3 children together. The first one, that was unplanned. I was only 15, but we stayed together and got married 2 years after the first one was born. All of my children are with this man, and all of his children are with me. We've been happy together since 2006, but as of late, I've been doubting him. For example, one night he did not come home, which is something he had never done before. And then about a week later, another night. Maybe if he was a security guard, but my husband is a welder, and welders don't work at night. I talked with him about it, and I told him about my suspicions. I even called our Uncosway. These are traditional marriage mediators. But they didn't help. They just said, "Well, after all, he is a man, and that's how men sometimes behave. You just have to accept it. There's no reason to end your marriage over some doubts. But I was not ready to accept that, not with this disease. My mother died from it when I was 1 year old. My father had already run away to Nsanje district. I was raised by my granny, but since I myself am an orphan, my own children don't have grandparents who could raise them. Oh, here, let's imagine this is Patuma. From there, I started hearing rumors about his behavior, hearing that he had another partner. My friend called me and told me she was standing at Mavutu Lodge, watching my husband enter that area with a woman. And she advised me, she said, Patuma, you have to catch him red-handed. So I started paying very close attention to where he was going and when, even following him from time to time. I usually just stay at home farming while he goes to work in town, but I started moving around to find out more about what he was really doing. Last week, I followed him to a certain place near where my friend had seen him. Indeed, he was meeting a woman there. The two of them went into the bush, you know, where people sometimes go to have sex. So I was right to have these doubts. Still, I didn't say anything to him. I just went home. The next day, I went to the bush in the late afternoon and I hid there for hours. I was so scared. I was scared of the bush buffalo trampling me. I was scared of being bitten by snakes, and I was cold. After waiting for hours, probably 6 hours, I went home in the dark, shivering. I was a mess. My husband was there at home, and I told him I had been visiting our friend who was at the hospital. I paid attention to how he was behaving, and I decided to go again to the bush. I hid on the ground in those grasses a bit far away from the road. I had not eaten anything since morning, so I was hungry and worried about snakes, but I had dressed more warmly this time. I had prepared well to hide in the bush, like an animal or like a mad person. And then I started thinking, what am I doing? I'm going to get killed, trampled by bush buffalo, or murdered by another mad person hiding in the bush. Just then, my husband appeared with that same woman. The woman was carrying a plastic bag with something he had given her. I stayed quiet, and they took off their clothes and started having sex. I moved closer, and when I saw that they were very busy, I crept near to pick up the trousers of my husband and a wrapper of that lady, and I crept to another spot to grab the bag. I returned to my home very late in the dark, and I was not happy, but I was proud of myself. In the bag, he had brought her 4 eggs, some tomatoes, and a small bottle of cooking oil. In the morning, I did my chores as usual. I washed his trousers and that wrapper along with all the other clothes. I hung everything out to dry. When the laundry had dried, I took down my own clothes and the children's clothes, but I left his trousers and that wrapper hanging outside the house. Later that day, my husband came home. I welcomed him and I asked him if he would like to eat, and he said he would. So I brought out the bag he had given to that lady, and I slowly took out the tomatoes and the eggs to prepare the food. We were sitting at the front of the house. I got my knife and started chopping the tomatoes. I was looking at him, but staying quiet. Then I asked him, please bring me some more charcoal for the stove so I can fry these eggs in this oil. He went around to where we keep the charcoal, and from there he could see his trousers and her wrapper hanging on our clothesline. So now we are discussing whether to end the relationship. We are still staying in the house together. Naturally, my husband has called the mediators to come to the house. Today, your project has asked me a lot of questions, including about my marital status, but the truth is that today, I don't know whether I am married or whether this marriage has ended. Now, don't know answers in survey research are typically regarded as a problem for us, right? A research anomaly, a violation of the assumption of perfect information, a source of missing data, frankly, a nuisance to analysts, right? Those dreaded 88s. But consider instead that don't know answers could be a portal to understanding the social world more deeply, and that they could be studied deliberately in an empirical framework. Patuma's difficulty answering the supposedly straightforward question about a basic demographic trait speaks volumes about the force of uncertainty in everyday life. It raises questions about what uncertainty about this marriage means to her, how prevalent it is for others in the community, and the consequences it has for how Patuma moves about in the world. Now, for the purposes of completing this questionnaire, we categorized her as married. Her answers to other adjacent questions, the suspicion of other partners, a question mark about whether the marriage will be intact a year from now, a recent call to the marriage mediators would indicate to analysts that this concerned with relationship quality, that this marriage is in a pretty fragile state. But this uncertain relationship is linked to another salient uncertainty, which is a question about her HIV status. Patuma had been tested for HIV 3 times in the previous year, twice during antenatal care, and once when she started suspecting her husband of having other partners. She indicated in our survey that she has friends who are HIV positive and that they are doing well thanks to antiretroviral therapy. She believes that if she tested positive today, she would probably get the treatment that she needed to live a long life, and she does not know her HIV status. Even upon receiving a negative result through the testing services offered within our study's protocol, Patuma still articulated doubts about her HIV status. Like thousands of other women in Balaka, she is uncertain, and she is navigating an epidemic of uncertainty. So when I call HIV an epidemic of uncertainty, I'm referring to an epidemic that has been going on for more than 30 years in sub-Saharan Africa and Balaka. Now, because HIV is an established disease, I want to suggest that the uncertainty that accompanies it cannot be attributed to novelty, the things that are things not yet known that with support from the scientific community in time will become known and figured out and clarify things. AIDS-related uncertainty that characterized Balaka today has been a stable fixture of social life across the globe. In AIDS endemic context, young adults are still facing the looming threat of HIV infection at every turn, which elevates the stakes of the decisions that they have to make. And this is true when we think about the 30 years of experience with HIV in this community. This is nationwide. These are nationwide estimates from the for Malawi as a whole. HIV prevalence has been pretty stable between 11 and 14% since the early 1990s. This is a metric that we watch very carefully. New infections were very, very high through in the 1990s, and then really declined around 2000 in the, during this period that Susan Watkins referred to as confusion to clarity, right? Behaviors started changing when people understood what HIV was and how it could be prevented. But this was exactly the time that AIDS-related mortality really kicked off, right? It rose precipitously and then declined around, started declining around 2005 and 2006. Now, these are the metrics that we pay close attention to. But I want to point out that really only AIDS-related mortality is visible to people in a community. HIV prevalence is pretty invisible, right? It's only the very sick that we can see in a population, and new infections are very difficult for individuals to perceive. Now, if we want to think about Patuma's life in terms of the arc of the longer epidemic, I've dropped some lines here, and all of the women in our study, including Patuma, were born between 1984 and 1994. I don't need to explain Alexis sort of space to all of you, but they were born at the time that the first HIV cases were registered. This means they never knew a world without HIV, right? HIV has always been part of their reality. UPE stands for Universal Primary Education. This is a cohort of women who started going where the universal schooling in Malawi has been a very, very successful program. All of the education may not be of the highest quality. It may not be what you want for your own kids. Nonetheless, basically everyone in our cohort has been to some secondary school, and most of them have finished it. Patuma was 15 or a little bit younger during those years of peak AIDS-related mortality, okay? People were attending between 5 and 6 funerals a month during this period of time, and after which time nevirapine and antiretrovirals became available, and mortality declined precipitously. As you see in this graph, mortality decline happened really, really fast. But that experience of very, very high mortality throughout adolescence and during developmentally formative years is a very important part of her narrative, right? When she says, my mother died of this disease when I was 1, my father disappeared, my children don't have grandparents. This is the experience of the whole cohort, even though not everyone has the exact same characteristics of Patuma, but these marks on kinship of the kinship network are very well described when she tells us why she's not going to tolerate her husband's, absence from home. So I want to move away from the ethnographic focus on this one very interesting and impressive, in my opinion, person, and try to walk through this argument that AIDS-related uncertainty is measurable, that it's pervasive in a population, impervious to biomedical solutions, by which I mean we can't test our way out of it, that it persists over time, even though the epidemic has changed dramatically in terms of mortality rates and available treatment, and that it's consequential. I know that sounds like a lot, but this stuff is pretty simple, so I'll be able to get through it quickly. And I know you're gonna
Yeah,
give me, we're doing okay?
10, 12 minutes.
Okay, I can do it. All right. AIDS-related certainty is something that's measurable. A lot of standard survey questions that have used the Likert style responses give us something like 10 and 15% don't know and refusals to answer. There's a great study in Mozambique fielded by Victor Agajanian among women of reproductive age, where up to 40% of the women in the sample don't answer the question, how likely is it that you're infected with HIV right now? So we did something a little different. We used a pile of 10 beans and a little cup and asked our respondents to place into the cup the beans that represented the likelihood of something happening, where 0 means it's not happening at all and 10 means this is definitely happening, okay? Now, we didn't start out with questions about HIV status. We started out with questions about going to the market, about staying in school, about who would win if we played a game of bow. We asked about a lot of gentle topics before moving in to questions related to HIV and mortality. So we asked them to move into the cup the number of beans representing the likelihood of being infected with HIV at this moment, becoming infected with HIV in the coming year, and being infected in their lifetime. And these histograms are really some of the most important things I think we found in our study. I mean, on the first day of their first interview, 60% of the young women in our study put 0 beans. They told us they do not have HIV and they were confident of that at that time. But when asked about the coming year, that dropped by more than 20 percentage points. And by the time we asked them to think about their future, to think about their lives, a 50-50 response, 5 beans, became the modal answer. And this is what I use to advance the argument that this is measurable and that it's something that we can look at in an empirical framework. We had basically no missing data. 2 respondents refused to answer these questions with beans out of 2,500, including men and women. It is predictive of HIV status when you use the beans to look at future infections, and also aligned with the known epidemiological patterns, specifically by age and by sex.
How do you interpret uncertainty in this context? If I don't know the answer, how many beans do I do? Do I do 0? Do I do 5? Is there, you can talk about that? Okay.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's just go there. I mean, so if you don't know and you, it depends on your way of not knowing, but I think in comparison to the Likert scale, this 1 to 10, the 0 to 10 reasoning allows us to see that. So the way that I've used the data are imagining sort of just pulling up the distribution by its middle and characterizing those who give answers like 4, 5, or 6 beans as those who really, really do not know. And articulations between 1 and 9 are an expression of any kind of ambiguity, any uncertainty. People who put 0 are insulated, especially those who are putting 0 about when asked about future time horizons. And 10 know that they're infected. They may have an HIV diagnosis, or they may think that they have it because they've inferred it from a partner or for some other reason.
So I guess my question is, I could say 5 because I have no idea.
Yes.
And I have kind of use Bayesian language to talk about this and that, but, or I could say 5 because I have a pretty precise idea that it's 50-50, and I'm pretty confident that it's 50-50.
Yeah.
Is there a conceptual difference between those 2 types
There's
of 5s?
there's a lot of heaping at 5, and I think that both of those are part of it, but I haven't taken like a lot of pains to distinguish.
And for your argument, is there a big difference between knowing that things are uncertain and just having no idea what the future brings? Maybe I'm not making a distinction, but I'm seeing a distinction there between I'm going to flip a coin, I know it's 50-50, and you're going to do some experiment. I don't even know what experiment it is and produce some number, but flipping a coin, I know the chances are 50-50, whereas I don't even know what your experiment
Yeah.
is.
So maybe it would be helpful if I answered it like with the like how likely is it that you're going to have that you're going to run out of food this month, right? A person who thinks that they're going to run out of food, who's experiencing high levels of uncertainty, is going to put 9 or 8 or 9 beans, whereas a person who just doesn't know, I think, is going to put 4 or 5. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So through the testing that we did in our study, you can see the patterns we established for new HIV infections over the period of the first 3 years that we were that we were following these women. Infections for, and this is men, this is the random sample, to Ted's point, this is the random sample of men, not the male partners, right? And infections for HIV infections for men actually peaked during the years of like 34 to 44, not as early as women. So basically, when we measure new infections through an HIV biomarker or through this expression of 10 beans, we see a very, very similar pattern according to what we know from blood spots and what people are telling us about their infections given 10 beans. And we have a gender difference here between men and women. But if we are thinking about the role of uncertainty, I want to contrast what we know of what the actual pattern looks like for new infections with this experience of acute uncertainty. This is people who put 4, 5, and 6 beans. Looking at it in terms of in a hazard framework, because it really wanted to know, like, are these uncertain people who are always uncertain, right? And they're telling us 5 beans, 5 beans, 5 beans all year long, or is this state that people are moving in and out of, and how are we to think about the differences? So acute uncertainty, we see there's basically no difference between men and women here. About half of the sample experiences acute uncertainty within the first 3 years of our study. And when we expand to any uncertainty, obviously a broader definition is going to give us a steeper hazard function by the end of, but when we think about people who make it through 3 years of the study without perceiving any uncertainty in their life on the time horizon of a lifetime infection, there are about 13 people left, right? I couldn't even do analyses on that insulated group. Now, the point that it's impervious to biomedical solutions, I address in light of campaigns aside from ABC. I think the other most prevalent campaign across sub-Saharan Africa, but it's also here in the United States and in a lot of other contexts as well, it's know your status, right? Get tested and then you will know. We designed into our study a randomized approach to testing people where some were tested every wave. One group was tested just in the middle of the study and at the very end, for which we wanted to see how people responded to surprises. And there was a third group, we tested them only at the end of the study, and we wanted to learn from them how they were navigating infrastructure to get tested in the community outside of our study, and how they were making decisions just based on their perceptions. Now, if testing gives people an certainty, we would expect to see differences between those experimental groups. And I didn't even put confidence intervals on these because there are no differences, right, between among the 3 experimental groups, despite how much testing they were getting in the course of our study. And this is true for acute uncertainty and also for the more expansive definition of any uncertainty. And this is very, very consistent with Patuma's narration, okay? She was tested in the course of our study. She doesn't know if she has it. Also, when you receive your test results, you are informed that you may have you may be infected and the antibodies may not be yet at a detectable level, right? If you've been tested in the United States, you've gotten the same information, right? That there's a window period, and only after a period of 2 to 4 months of no exposure and repeated negative tests can you know for certain that you don't have HIV. So there is a lot of information. There are a lot of reasons to be uncertain embedded in the testing protocols themselves. Were you going to ask something else, Josh?
I thought earlier that when people were asked about their status now, that there was a big difference between my status in a few years. So these people who are getting tested every time, they're basically being asked about their status now over and over again.
So everyone in our study is being asked about their status, and some of them after answering those questions are also getting tested and receiving a result.
But the people, what you're saying is the people who are tested receive a result, they are just as uncertain as the people who've never got a test. That's what these lines are showing.
Yes, there are very few women who never got a test because pregnancy is so common and many women are getting tested in antenatal care or they have opportunities to test somewhere else. So I can't say that they've never gotten a test, but 8 from us versus none from us, or 1 at the very end of the study is the difference that this is getting at.
So a couple of quick reactions, which was in trying to get myself in the heads of the folks who are answering, like, they know there's a project going on, there's testing, you guys are concerned about this. Do you feel, there's 2 questions. One is, do you feel like they thought there was a right answer, which is the right answer is to say, look, there's a lot of HIV out there, it's really dangerous. I should say, you know, I'm at risk. If I put a 0, it means like I'm kind of telling these people I'm not at risk, this program isn't that important. So the right answer is to say there's some risk. And the second one is a little bit different, which is like, some people don't like to tempt fate. And they do think of getting infected as there's a religious component or spiritual component. So if I say 0, I'm tempting fate. I'm like, I'm definitely not infected. Okay, I'm going to get punished for saying I'm a 0. So the safest thing to do is like, oh yeah, I'm at risk. I'm at risk. I acknowledge I'm at risk. You guys are telling me it's risky. I know there's risk out there. I'm going to say 5. But that may be a little different than really thinking I'm infected. I don't know. Those are just 2 reactions I had about like the answers they're giving versus.
You were saying that about tempting fate, and I'm about to not.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, we have that
I would
tradition
never
of,
say never, right? I think if that were true, I think I would expect to see in these histograms a lot more 1s than we see, right? 1 is the correct answer, right? Even in a high prevalence society, most people do not have HIV. Right? And very few people in this study have many sex partners and are not using condoms. And so the correct answer would be 1, but that's not really how it's manifest in the population. If you think that this is getting at something sort of emotions about the psychology of the disease in the population. So I want to show make one last point about sort of the stickiness. This isn't one last point, but repeating this again and again through these different periods. 2009 when the study first started, 2012 as treatment became good, 2015 and 2019 we were at a point of universal test and treatment, meaning that everyone who gets a diagnosis of HIV is supposed to be started on antiretrovirals that same day. Okay, there's a huge decline in AIDS-related mortality over this period of time, and people know that women with HIV can have healthy babies, that they're living long lives, and that they're doing well. Nonetheless, these histograms do not change at all over this period of time, even though the features of the epidemic change quite a bit. Now, my last empirical point is that this uncertainty is consequential. I wrote a paper with Sarah Yateman about the relationship between HIV uncertainty and fertility preferences, thinking about the preferred time to next birth, which we published in the ASR. But to illustrate how this matters, this uses all the data from all of the waves in our study. And if we think about a biomedical view or a serostatus view of the differences in self-rated health, days missed of school or work, depression, and life satisfaction along the lines of serostatus. And this is the same whether I use the biomarker or whether I use the beans distinguishing people who put 10 from people who put anything else. We see pretty expected patterns, specifically in self-rated health. The confidence intervals here are pretty big, but these are exactly what we would expect in terms of the difference between those who are living with HIV and those who are not. But when we look at all of these outcomes, the spectrum of uncertainty, or on the spectrum of risk, thinking about uncertainty, well, we see that self-rated health begins to decline at the expression of 3 beans, okay? Only sick days follows something that looks a little bit linear. Depression kicks off with the expression of uncertainty at only 1 bean, and life satisfaction starts to plummet at about 5 beans, or the expression of acute uncertainty as I've defined it. And I think that this shows us that when we just look at the world according to serostatus, of course, we need that data in order to think about antenatal care, in order to think about distribution of antivirals. But for thinking about other outcomes that could be related to HIV, I think that we're really missing a lot by neglecting uncertainty as a state when it's characterizing up to 40% of the population. So this AIDS-related uncertainty or HIV-related uncertainty is layered with other kinds of uncertainty specifically. And in the book, I use some of these same tools to look at things like suspicion of husbands and other kinds of features of relationships, and also personal risk of mortality and livelihoods. And the point I want to end on is saying is that, you know, I would like to go further than saying that I think that uncertainty is something that we should look at. It's something we should try to understand better. It enhances our understandings. I really think that we will get important things fundamentally wrong if we don't integrate this into our perspective of epidemics. HIV is only one of many conditions that people live with and experience, but that is, you know, what I really hope to convince people of through the book and through the research more broadly. So with that, I will thank you for your attention and take more questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. So we're open for questions. The room gets priority. We get to go to the interview.
Okay, thank you. This is great. I wanted to ask about how we should understand subjective understandings of probabilities in cases that are outside epidemics that look really similar, and to like then understand how much the context matters. So of course, I'm thinking of the uncertainty of pregnancy. People, you know, at maximum fecundity, about 20% are getting pregnant. People think it's 100%. There's a lot of great research showing the results of that kind of misunderstanding in terms of people's behavior and outcomes. And so in like a lot of ways, it looks like very similar. There's the sort of constant testing and questioning, but there's not really the same experience of extreme mortality, risk. I guess there is sort of the same sort of public health messaging, and in some ways, like in our current context of abortion, like extreme consequences. But yeah, it's not necessarily based on the epidemic, just maybe public health misunderstanding.
Yeah, I think what's extremely similar about the example that you just raised is that it's another example where people are specifically taught probabilities that are incorrect, right? According to my understanding of the literature. I mean, maybe not everyone had the same kind of sex education I had, but I was definitely taught that like I would get pregnant, you know, and that turns out not to be true, you know, every single time. And it's also true with the messaging around HIV, right? The messaging is that like it is extremely contagious, and that runs counter to what we know from the good studies of transmission, female to male, male to female, absent STIs. There are a lot of other factors that can change those probabilities, but actually male to female transmission is something like 1 in 300 between healthy people, and that's not what's been communicated to large numbers of people over the course of 30 years, right? And so I think the actual probabilities, how it's discussed in formal settings, and then what it looks like in everyday discourse and this population chatter it's different from what kids are learning in school in a life skills class or in a sex education class, or what they hear at the mosque or in a church. But nonetheless, I think that's quite similar. And I think there are costs, right, to let's call it sort of fear-based messaging about likelihoods that change the presence of something in a population. And that has consequences, I think.
Right.
it does in your case, right? Because people are behaving as if.
Yeah, or all the other research about people who assume they're infertile because they didn't get pregnant from having sex, and then they have an unintended pregnancy from the assumption of infertility when so.
And that's a good illustration for these perceptions having real consequences, right? Thank you.
I was really interested that you asked that you use these beam questions on non-HIV topics also. Did you look at those data? Do people use the beams the same way? I mean, what did you learn? Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely examined the beans data. I think one of the things I was most worried about when I started doing the analyses is like, are people straight lining, right? Does someone put 5 for everything that we asked about? So I've examined it in order to, check that is not really what's driving it. They're predictive for a number of things. They're highly predictive of divorce when we ask people about the likelihood of staying with their same partner and of getting married. The Beans measures are highly predictive of pregnancy for people who do want to, or who express a likelihood of becoming pregnant in the next year. We see an association with live births. We also asked about other things, being able to buy land, getting a steady job. Very few people think that they're going to have that they're going to be able to get a steady job in the coming year, which does accurately reflect the economic situation. Those have not been analyzed thoroughly. So if anyone's looking for more data or collaboration or MA paper, there's a lot of potential in the things that we asked about. They correspond mostly to livelihoods, relationships, HIV, mortality.
Will, and then I saw a question from Ron. Do we have the questions in the room before I go on Ron? So, Will?
Just thinking about these subjective probabilities, there's some studies, I can't remember whether you said you did this, but they'll ask an individual about the probability that they will have HIV. Then they ask about the population probability. So you ask about every 10 people like you, how many of them do you think will ever contract HIV in their lifetime? And that essentially reduces some of the uncertainty, right? And then implicitly people are thinking a big N now. And we often see very different distributions in those. I'm wondering if you tried that as a different way of sort of measuring the uncertainty.
Yeah, I wish that I remembered exactly the way that we asked some questions about imagining a woman like you who has sex with a man who is infected with HIV one time. What is the likelihood? We asked a couple questions like that, and they were very, very consistent. I know the answers that we got were consistent with things that Hans-Peter Kohler and others have gotten in their studies in Malawi. They've looked at it a little bit more closely. And Jason Kerwin has also done some research on this. So we asked a few questions along those lines, but it wasn't a major focus of ours. I mean, I think that I was pretty convinced that what people in our study believed about these probabilities was pretty similar to what people had found recently in neighboring districts. So we didn't ask a ton about it.
Ron, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Yeah. You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for this great talk. Very interesting. I learned a lot. I noticed that it is all framed in terms of the uncertainty of getting or having HIV/AIDS. And if I try to imagine myself in that circumstance, my probably bigger concern would be whether I would get HIV/AIDS and die from it. And so the ART becoming available whenever that was, around 2010, and then becoming better known, and people know, then they have friends who are living with it, and it becomes trusted and so on, I should think would just dramatically change, what should I say, the weight attached to that uncertainty about getting it in some way. Though given that, I was surprised to see, the last histograms you showed, which, yeah, did suggest that just the uncertainty about getting it was affecting people's lives even now pretty strongly.
Yes, the consequences of living with HIV have changed a lot. And I think antiretrovirals, I mean, it's important to know that antiretrovirals also change the probabilities of becoming infected, right, of HIV acquisition for individuals and at the population level. So that does change too, alongside with the mortality. We asked people questions about mortality, including the likelihood that they would be alive in 5 years and in 10 years. Actually, we asked about death within a year, within 5 years, and within 10 years. And we also asked about likely causes of death, including HIV, including cancer, and including accidents and other things that are other prevalent causes of death in Malawi. And there is some evidence that the perception of that an AIDS-related death is declining over time. And I think it's important, and it's also real, but there is a serious lag in terms of these perceptions. I mean, I think when you go to, we sort of think back to Patuma's story, or you look at the graph and see the HIV, where the HIV mortality rises so high and then drops. I mean, because that was the formative experience for people, and because they are still going to quite a number of funerals, many of which are due to AIDS right now. And it's not necessarily due to HIV shortly after infection, but a lot of the AIDS-related deaths we're seeing are 8 to 10 years after a person has been on antiretroviral drugs and they don't have access to second-line drugs, right? Where the sort of standard treatment antiretrovirals are no longer working, sort of what we would call it drug resistance. They say, when you get to 45, the drugs stop working on the body, right? That is the sort of that's something that I hear a lot, right? So it's attributable to age. However, it is telling us something about how long those drugs are working for and are keeping people alive for. I'm not sure if that answers your question exactly, Ron, but you're correct, and I hope it comes through, right? That like, even though HIV is not as deadly as it once was, this uncertainty isn't shifting in the same way, but it is a absolutely different reality, and it's one of the great accomplishments of the global health community in the last couple of years that HIV mortality has reached the low levels it's at now compared to 2005.
Thank you very much.
Thank our speaker. Thanks so much.